Take your CJ7 all the way to 11. Jeepin' with Cool Guy.
Good evening, folks, and welcome to another episode of Jeepin' with Cool Guy. It's been a couple months since I put my last video out. Just gotten to a point where a lot of the restoration components of the two Jeeps that I've got are down to the minutia. There's not a whole lot left to do. But one thing I ran into over the course of the summer was a problem that I think a lot of people recently have been having, and it's the manual fuel pump. Basically, the response that you'll get when you ask out on the Facebook forums or in the chat forums, go electric, get an electric fuel pump. Well, that sounds all great and nice, but those things also have a lot of their problems on their own. There's the voltage regulation, fuel pressure, a lot of other things. It's a lot more complicated system than the manual fuel pumps that are in the traditional AMC Jeep CJ7s, 5s, on the 258s, the 304s, 360s, blah, blah, blah. But this one in particular is for the 258. Over the course of the summer, I went through 5 fuel pumps. 5. And summer months being basically from late April all the way until early October. One of them made it about 350 miles, and then it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. Toward the last one, made it for 150 feet. Like, I backed it out of the driveway, went up to the stop sign, took a left, and the fuel pump went out. And I'm like, all right, there's something majorly wrong in the fact that it's a manual fuel pump. That means that it operates off of the camshaft. There is nothing technical about this. Tried to figure out what was going on and why these things were breaking down so fast and so often. One of the things that I will talk about through the process of this video is the brand that I recommend going with, at least in right now. The funny thing about it was, within those 5 fuel pumps that I did over the course of the summer, 2 of them were Delphi, one of them was Crown Omex Zeta, and then the other 2 was Carter. Those are all the big names really in the manual fuel pump for the AMC Jeep CJs on the 258s, and I was at a complete loss. Is it ethanol in the fuel? Was it a supply chain issue? Were these things sitting on a boat in the middle of the Pacific for 6 months? Don't know. But what I did find out in the process of calling a lot of the customer support numbers of these different manufacturers, you're going to get the exact same response. Our products are up to code, and they should be able to handle all different levels of ethanol and so on. What really is the problem is that there's either a bad batch, or they've just gotten to the point where they are using such cheap rubber for the diaphragm that actually creates the vacuum off of the lever in the fuel pump, that the things rip through almost immediately. So the longevity of them seems to be, at this point, gone. Now, with that big diatribe already said, what we're going to do is we're going to remove the one that I have in here now. It's perfectly fine. It works great. I didn't put any RTV on the gasket that goes between the fuel pump and the engine block. I'm getting a little bit of an oil leak, and not a big deal, but I'd prefer to have it nice and cleaned up. So the good thing is that we're going to be pulling a working fuel pump out of here, and I'm just going to show you the process to remove it, and then I'm going to show you the process to install it. Now, before we actually get into the process of it, I wanted to go over the fuel pump itself. This is made by US Motor Works. The only place that I've been able to find it is on Rock Auto. I'm not getting anything from these companies, US Motor Works or Rock Auto. I'm just telling you where I found one that actually works and is held up. And when I say held up, is it has held up since the last install, which would have been in August, and it is now very end of November. And I've put probably 1,000 miles on it, and I haven't had a single issue other than that little bit of oil leak. So what makes the US Motor Works manual fuel pump better? Don't really know. I did do a little bit of research on their website and the description that they put in there. You know, they run it through your typical quality controls and everything that goes with it. But the one thing that they do offer on there is I think it's a lifetime guarantee, maybe, on this thing. So that tells me something. Now you have to jump through hoops to get that warranty, like you're supposed to drain out your fuel tank and replace your fuel filters and so on. I didn't really need to do that because in the previous videos I showed you that I'd done all of that. Even within that, that gives me a little bit more of a confidence in the quality of the product. Now, basically it has to prove itself out, right? So it has, at least in my opinion, to be really quality. So Rock Auto, look up CJ7 258, and it's US Motor Works. I think it's a little bit more expensive than the other ones, but the funny thing was that I had gotten to the point where, I think it was after the third fuel pump replacement, I had bought 2 ahead of time, and I was keeping them in the back of the Jeep with all of the tools that I needed to replace it, because I had fears of actually taking this and going to like the drive-in movie theater, which is like 3 miles away. That is not the kind of Jeep that I want to have, but I haven't had a single problem since then. So here's a close-up of the fuel pump. This is the lever that gets inserted into the engine, and this is the part of the lever that rotates on the camshaft lobe. So as the camshaft lobe, which is shaped like an egg, as it rotates, it pushes this thing up. Now, if you push really hard, you can actually hear it. So that's the vacuum that is created by the diaphragm. So that's actually really powerful. Anyways, there's a lot of tension within the spring for this thing. So that's how your manual fuel pump works. Really super simple. Fuel goes in, gets sucked in by the pressure created by the camshaft lobe, moving this lever up and down, and then it pushes the fuel across that diaphragm and then up through the output. See a lot of people asking what this little hole is, and there's 1 out of 10 responses is correct. It's not a weep hole. It's not a drain hole. It's not a vent hole either. All this really is a hole that goes up into this area that provides an atmospheric release, air release more or less, of the diaphragm on the inside as it gets pressed up and down. The air that's in this lower chamber just moves in and out, just very slightly. So this is so that there isn't a buildup of pressure on the inside of the pump. It has absolutely nothing to do with the fuel flow. And if you have fuel coming out of here, you're toast. It's over. It's done. So here's the gaskets that come with the US Motor Works fuel pump. And I think all the fuel pump companies, manufacturers provide you with 2. But there's a slight difference between these and the US Motor Works version and the other ones. These seem to have some kind of a waxy film on them. It's not like a sealant, but it just feels like the paper, and they're all made out of this paper-like material, fibrous paper material. This just seems to have a smooth finish on it, like there's some kind of a waxy substance. So when I install this time, I didn't do it the first time, and I don't know why. Probably it's because I figured I was going to be pulling it off in a couple days. There's no point in using sealant, because why waste it? I'm going to be using this stuff called Indian Head Shellac, which is this stuff right here. It's by Permatex. It's just a gasket shellac compound. This stuff is awesome. I used it for my valve cover gasket with the cork. It works incredibly well with everything that's not rubber. So if you've got paper, cork, gasket type of material, you're going to want to go with this over the RTV. The RTV is built out of silicone, so it's not going to infiltrate and seal necessarily and bond with the organic material like paper or cork. This stuff is really great. It smells terrible and it stains, but it's really good stuff to work with. Basically, if you put a gasket on with this stuff, you're never going to have a problem with your gasket again. Okay, we're on the passenger side of the vehicle. The fuel pump's right here. And this is the clear fuel filter that I was telling you about before. You just need a very simple clear plastic fuel filter. This way you can see that if you actually have fuel coming through and up into the fuel pump, and you can also see the color of the fuel. It's just a nice way to preemptively eliminate anything that could get into the diaphragm of the fuel pump that could potentially cause it problems. To remove this, you're only going to need a few tools. You'll need those pliers to remove the clamp that's on the input for the fuel pump. You'll need a 1/2 inch and a 5/8 inch crescent wrench so that you can remove the fuel line. And then you'll need a 1/2 inch wrench or socket. You're going to also need a pair of rubber gloves. And then you're also going to need some kind of a drip pan and a towel. Because when you remove all these hoses, all the fuel that's sitting in here is going to leak out. What you want to do is you want to get some kind of a plastic container or a drip pan and put it underneath the fuel pump. Rest it down on top of the axle, trying to get it oriented to where anything that drips out will just fall into it. It's not that big of a deal. It's easy cleanup. There's not a ton of fuel that's going to come out of here, but there's potential for at least enough to come from the fuel line that goes all the way over to the carburetor to drain out, which can be a little messy. And you don't want to mess with fuel. So once you got that situated, the first thing that we want to do is to remove the fuel line, the output nut first. To do that, you're going to need two things. 2 wrenches, a 1/2 and a 9/16. I misspoke earlier. I think I said 5/8 and a 1/2. The nut that goes, that's actually part of the fuel pump, is the 9/16. And you just want to have that wrench so that you, or spin the nut. So 1/2 inch goes on the top, your flange line, 9/16 on the bottom, part of the fuel pump nut, and you just want to break that seal. And after that, you should be able to just do it with your hand, your finger. See how much fuel comes out of there. Not a lot. Oh, there it goes. I'm going to grab a towel to help out. Plug it up. So I'm going to turn this fuel line up to where it's pointing up as much as I can, since there isn't a lot of fuel draining out of it. There's that. Also remember, there's going to be a fair amount of fuel that's currently in this pump. So from the input nozzle to the output nozzle, this is all going to be full of fuel. So you want to keep it as level as you can when you remove it. Alright, let's move on to the input line, the clamp, the hose clamp. Slide that down. Alright, before we remove the hose, got the heater box radiator hoses out of the way, zip tied them up. When you remove this hose here, mine is a new configuration, so basically it's a new fuel line. Look at my previous videos that show you the fuel routing. But new filter, new hose. If yours is original or old or has been on there for multiple years, this hose is going to be conformed to this nozzle and it's going to be brittle and hard to get off. So grabbing a screwdriver and wedging this thing off, or a pair of pliers to just kind of break that seal of that old rubber hose, is going to be beneficial. So this should slide off fairly easy. Let's see if we get a lot of fuel. Nah, I didn't get a lot. Alright, that's good. So I'm going to move this out of the way, prop it up against one of the wires. Next thing that we want to do is to remove the 2 mounting bolts that are on both sides of the mounting flange of the fuel pump. These are 1/2 inch head, I think 1 inch long bolts. I'm going to use a ratcheting wrench for this. You could use a socket wrench. It's just kind of hard to get it in there. You have to have an extension on it. And even with these ratcheting wrenches, there's not a lot of room. This thing butts right up against the shaft of the fuel pump. As you remove or loosen up these bolts, the fuel pump is going to start shifting down because there's a fair amount of pressure of the lever, the activating lever, sitting on the camshaft lobe. Or these bolts may not just loosen up to be finger loose immediately just because of that tension that is provided on the fuel pump arm. Now, interestingly enough, watch the fuel output port as I loosen up this bolt. You can see how the arm is released on the camshaft because the fuel is starting to spill out over the top. See it? So that's something. Oh, wow. That's something to take note of. Wear glasses, and I think that we might want to drain that fuel out somehow. Maybe use a cloth so that it doesn't spit all over the place. Alright, so I'm going to put just a cloth over the top of this thing while I unbolt this. Not a whole lot to see. Okay, so hopefully my head doesn't get in the way too much here, but got it pretty much loosened up. A lot more fuel came out of this thing than I was hoping for. As you get these bolts released, let's pull them out nice and easy. Yeah, that's 1 inch long, and that's all it is, and then it just simply comes out. Remember, there's two things you want to be aware of. Like I said before, there's a whole lot of fuel in here, so you want to keep this level so you don't spill fuel all over your body. And then also realize that there's going to be oil in the fuel pump's pump arm, just because that sits inside of the engine cavity. 2 more steps before we install. First is to remove the old gasket. Now this should just come off nice and easy. Yours, if it's an older one, you're probably going to need a putty knife. You want to be very careful when you scrape off the gasket material off of this. But you want to make sure that this surface is very clean. A little bit more prep work before we go for the install. Grab some acetone, put it on a cloth. Make sure that all the oils and other such crappy things, including tissue, are off the surface. This does not have to be like a mirror, meaning that there can be absolutely nothing on here. You just want to make sure you get as much of the material off as you can and then get the surface cleaned up so that your shellac will adhere as well as you want it to. Okay, so this next part is kind of hard to explain. So this arm rests on the lobe of the camshaft, and as that camshaft rotates, it pushes the arm up and down, and that's what creates your vacuum, and that's why it's a mechanical fuel pump. When you remove this, there's no way, really any way of knowing at what point that egg-shaped lobe on the camshaft is pointing. The ideal installation of the fuel pump is when the camshaft lobe is at its flattest point. And the reason why you want that is so that when you install this, this is resting at its almost at the state that it's at now. And that makes it a lot easier to be able to insert the bolts into the engine block. Otherwise, you have to put the arm in, rest it on the camshaft lobe, and then push down on the fuel pump so that you can get the holes for the bolt mounting bolts aligned. You want to insert the arm high so that it rests down on top of the lobe, and then you try and square up the mounting flange of the fuel pump with the engine block. Mine's actually fairly square, so I might be really close to the flattest point in that lobe. If yours isn't the case and it's more like this, where you have a significant angle, what you're going to want to do is you'll just want to get a 3/4 inch wrench or a breaker bar with a 3/4 inch socket on it, and you'll just want to rotate your crankshaft bolt 3/4 of a turn, 1/4 of a turn, to where you can get the lowest point on this fuel pump arm to engage with the camshaft, because otherwise it is really hard to install it, and the last thing you want to do is strip out or cross thread your bolts. Alright, so let's put the shellac on this stuff. As you can see when I pull this thing out, it's kind of black, brown, dark brown, oily mess. But the stuff is amazing. So I'm only going to put it on one side of the gasket. So at least for the Motorworks version, there's one side that has a really waxy kind of surface to it. I'm going to apply that to the engine side, and then the less waxy side, I'm going to apply the shellac to the fuel pump side of this. Just a nice light film on it. Now I need to go overboard. And now we can install this on the engine. Through my experiences, I've found that it's a lot easier to install this thing all at once. So put your gasket on the fuel pump and thread the bolts through the holes, because otherwise it becomes really difficult to maneuver this thing in there, get everything aligned without getting the stuff all over the place and making it more difficult just to get the gasket into place. Thread one end in, a couple threads, then thread the other one in, a couple more threads, and then just back and forth, thread it in a few threads until you start getting resistance, meaning that the pump lever arm is starting to slide up over the top of the camshaft lobe, and it starts to get really hard to do it just with your fingers. Alright, you will need a torque wrench to do this, because these are only supposed to be 16 foot-pounds. And the last thing you want to do is overdo this, because your fuel pump is an aluminum casting, and you also don't want to strip out the bolts. So like before, make sure that you alternate between the two bolts as you're threading these in. And I would also do that on the poundage as well. 16, 16. We've got that installed. All you really need to do is just attach the hoses back. So slide that on, move the hose clamp up. I would advise installing a clear fuel filter before your fuel pump, in between the tank and the fuel pump. Anywhere you want. I just like having it right here because when I start it up and when I'm running it and testing it, I can see the fuel filling up into this canister. And it's just a nice visual way to be able to assess whether I'm getting fuel, how much fuel I'm getting, and so on. Then I'm going to install the output hose. This is just simply screwing this down into here. Now again, be very careful when you're screwing this down, and you should get very little resistance. If you get a lot of resistance, then you're starting to cross thread it. The last thing you want to do is cross thread this thing, because then you have to replace this nut, you have to replace the pipe, and obviously you have to replace the fuel pump itself because of that. Alright, 9/16 for the fuel pump, 1/2 inch for the fuel line nut. You don't want to rotate this one, you only want to rotate the fuel line nut. This is supposed to be 18 foot-pounds. I don't have any way of assessing what 18 foot-pounds would be on a nut like this, so I'm just gonna tighten it down nice and snug. Now what I'm gonna find is when I start the engine up, if I've got fuel leaking out through this, I obviously need to tighten it up a little bit more. I don't think I'm gonna have that problem, but that remains to be seen. One last point about the fuel system. This is the fuel filter. This is a standard fuel filter for the 258 between the fuel pump and the carburetor. It has 3 ports. One on the input side, front of the vehicle, coming from the fuel pump, and then 2 on the back side that point towards the back of the vehicle. The carburetor fuel line is the one that's in the center, just like on the back part of it. The one nozzle that is on the outer edge of the fuel filter is for the fuel return line. I've seen lots of people have fuel problems because they can't figure out why their carburetor isn't getting fuel. It's because they have this nozzle that outer edge one, the fuel return line, rotated to where it's on the bottom of the fuel filter. The reason that that doesn't work is because when the fuel goes in here, it builds up in here and then goes straight into the carburetor. So if you have the fuel return line at the bottom part of it, obviously it's going to go to the path of least resistance, and the fuel is going to go right into the fuel filter and right back to the tank. So you want to make sure that you have the fuel return line port at 12 o'clock on the fuel filter. Alright, so before you go and start your CJ up, see if it all works and everything's sealed up, you want to give 12 hours for that shellac to set up and to harden. Kind of like RTV a little bit. It takes a little while to set up, but to make sure that you've got a good seal there, just give it a little bit of time. That's pretty much it. The installation is, as you can tell, very simple. Hopefully you don't get good at it. So, what did we learn from this episode? 1, US Motor Works has apparently a really good manual fuel pump. Where do you get it? Rock Auto. Am I getting any kickbacks from anybody on this? No. This is just what I've found. Done a little bit of research, tried to check in a lot of things, and this is the best option that I have found. So hopefully you don't have any more complications and you don't have to keep 3 fuel pumps sitting in the back of your Jeep just because you never know when 2 of them are going to go out in a matter of 10 miles. If you have any questions, put it in the comments. I'd love to hear feedback on whether this is beneficial. Did you learn anything? I know I learned something. And last but not least, the most important part of all of this is to like and subscribe, because it just makes me feel better about myself. Oh, and one last thing. Don't be a crappy previous owner. Everybody hates a crappy previous owner.